The story that you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts, featuring characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Jimmy Hoffa was an American labor union leader who served as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, or the IBT, from 1957 until 1971, and then disappeared on July 30, 1975. James Riddle Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913 in Indiana. His father was of Pennsylvanian Dutch descent who died when Hoffa was 7 years old from a lung disease. His mother was of Irish ancestry. In 1924, the family moved from Indiana to Detroit in search of higher-paying jobs in the factories. At 14 years old, he left school to help support his family and began working full-time manual labor jobs. He worked as a stockboy for his first job and worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for a total weekly pay of $12. When the stock market crashed in 1929, he began working the 12-hour night shift at the loading docks of a warehouse where the working conditions were poor and employees were paid 32 cents per hour, but only when they were unloading boxcars, which meant that they often sat for hours without getting paid any compensation for their time. Teaming up with two others, Hoffa led a strike of his 175-man night shift. He was only 17 years old. They refused to unload a shipment until the company agreed to negotiate for better working conditions. The teenager negotiated the first contract. Despite his youth, Hoffa's fearlessness and approachability in that capacity impressed co-workers, and he ascended to become a leader. By 1932, Hoffa had quit the supermarket chain, partly due to his labor actions after refusing to work for an abusive shift foreman. He was then invited to join Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit as an organizer. Organizing a union was a difficult task. Employers deployed local mafia goons as strike breakers, and the police sided with the employers rather than the workers. Hoffa retaliated. He hired members of another local gang to go up against the hired muscle of his employers. Hoffa formed contacts with mafia members after being put in contact with them, which helped the Teamsters succeed. The Teamsters were founded in 1903 and had 75,000 members by 1933. As a result of Hoffa's efforts with other union leaders to consolidate local union trucker groups into regional sections and then into a national body, membership increased to 170,000 members by 1936 and 420,000 members 3 years later. During World War II and the post-war growth, the number of members steadily increased, eventually reaching 1 million by 1951. Hoffa was a key figure in the union's strategic use of quickie strikes, secondary boycotts, and other tactics to build union strength at one company, then move on to organizing employees and finally win contract demands at other companies. He was the top Teamster in Detroit by the age of 21. He was chairman of the Central States Drivers Council by 1940 when he was 27 years old, and he negotiated with companies in 23 American states. He became the president of the Michigan Conference of Teamsters in just 2 years. From the late 1930s until the late 1940s, Hoffa campaigned to defend the Teamsters from raids by other unions, especially the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and he expanded the Teamsters' dominance in the Midwest. He became president of Local 299 in December 1946, despite never having worked as a truck driver. Shortly after, he became the leader of the United Group of Detroit area locals and then became the head of the Michigan Teamsters groups. Meanwhile, Hoffa was able to avoid military service during World War II by successfully arguing that his union leadership abilities would be of greater benefit to the nation if he could keep freight moving efficiently to aid the war effort. He eventually became the union's president in 1957, and he was a very influential leader. He worked on the union's growth and development, as well as assisting individuals who were members in obtaining higher pay. The Teamsters eventually became one of the most powerful unions in the United States as a result of this process, which was started in the early 1930s. In that era, the trucking unions were heavily influenced and/or controlled by elements of organized crime. To be able to unify and expand trucking unions, he had to make accommodations and arrangements with many gangsters, starting in the Detroit area. Organized crime influence on the IBT would expand as the union itself grew. Hoffa worked to expand the union after his re-election as president in 1961. In 1964, he was successful in uniting nearly all over-the-road truck drivers in North America under a single national master freight agreement, which may have been his most significant accomplishment in a lifetime of labor activism. Hoffa then attempted but had little success to organize airline and other transportation workers into the union. During this time, he was under investigation, on trial, appealing convictions or imprisoned for nearly the entire decade of the 1960s. Despite being convicted of jury manipulation and mail fraud in court judgments that were stayed pending appeal, Hoffa was re-elected without opposition to a third five-year term as the president of the IBT. Delegates at Miami Beach also chose Frank Fitzsimmons as first vice president, with the possibility of becoming president if Hoffa has to serve a jail term. As a result of the McClellan Committee, Hoffa was the subject of major criminal investigations for the first time in 1957. Hoffa was arrested on March 14, 1957, for allegedly attempting to bribe a select committee staffer. Hoffa denied the charges and was subsequently acquitted, but his arrest prompted more investigations, arrests, and indictments in the weeks that followed. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy was elected president, he named his younger brother Robert to the position of Attorney General. While working as counsel to the McClellan Subcommittee, Robert Kennedy had been frustrated in previous attempts to convict Hoffa. Kennedy pursued a major war on organized crime as Attorney General from 1961, and he continued with a Get Hoffa squad of prosecutors and investigators. During his 1962 conspiracy trial in Nashville, Hoffa was charged with attempted bribery of a grand juror and was arrested for jury tampering in Tennessee in May 1963. On March 4, 1964, Hoffa was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Hoffa was convicted of 1 count of conspiracy and 3 charges of mail-and wire fraud for unlawful use of the Teamsters Pension Fund in a second trial held in Chicago on July 26, 1964, while on bail pending his appeal. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Hoffa spent the next 3 years attempting to overturn his 1964 convictions, but he was unsuccessful. His chief counsel, St. Louis defense attorney Morris Schenker, took his case to the United States Supreme Court. On March 7, 1967, he began serving his whole sentence of 13 years in jail, 8 years for bribery and 5 years for fraud at the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. When Hoffa was sentenced to prison, the unions named Frank Fitzsimmons to be the acting president, and Hoffa planned to manage the organization from behind bars through Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons was a Hoffa supporter, a fellow Detroiter, and a long-standing member of Teamsters Local 299 who owed much of his success to Hoffa's influence. Despite this, after 1967, Fitzsimmons began to separate himself from Hoffa's influence and authority, much to Hoffa's dismay. Fitzsimmons also decentralized power inside the IBT's administrative structure, giving up a lot of the control Hoffa had as union president. Hoffa did not have to serve the entire 13-year sentence since President Richard Nixon granted him a pardon, and he was released from prison in 1971. Jimmy Hoffa was not allowed to participate in the union process again until the end of his sentence in 1980 as part of the deal. Jimmy Hoffa, on the other hand, did not stay around for long since he vanished in July 1975. This are some of the facts about his disappearance that have come to light. Hoffa left his home in his green Pontiac Granville at 2:00 p.m. on July 30, 1975 to meet 2 fellow mobsters, Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, at the Matches Red Fox restaurant. Hoffa called his wife shortly after to tell her they hadn't arrived yet. He told her he would be home at 4 p.m. and to grill steaks for dinner. When Hoffa did not return home, his wife filed a missing person report. His car was discovered at the restaurant, but there was no indication of Hoffa's location. A truck driver saw Hoffa with three other unidentified individuals in a Mercury Marquis that nearly crashed with his vehicle as it exited the Red Fox, and this seems to be the last time he was seen alive. The description of the vehicle perfectly matched one owned by Anthony Giacaloni's son that was being used by Hoffa's friend, Chucky O'Brien, at that time. Already suspicious of O'Brien due to recent tiffs with Hoffa, authorities seized the vehicle on August 21. Search dogs detected Hoffa's scent inside, but no other evidence was found. Giacaloni and Provenzano denied having scheduled a meeting with Hoffa and were found to not have been near the restaurant that afternoon. Despite the extensive surveillance and bugging, investigators found that the mafia members who they thought were involved were not willing to talk about Hoffa's disappearance, even in private. The trail became cold at this point. By 1982, the FBI had pronounced Hoffa deceased because of extended absence, but no one knew where his remains were. There is no evidence surrounding his disappearance, but there are no limits to the speculations as to why he might have vanished and where he might be now. It wasn't until 2001, over 2 decades later, that forensic evidence surfaced, possibly pointing to a resolution to the case. A strand of Jimmy Hoffa's hair discovered in a bush was matched to hair discovered in a car driven by Charles O'Brien. The hair was discovered in 1975, but it wasn't until DNA testing that a conclusive match was discovered. When fellow mobster Frank Sheeran released his memoir in 2004, claiming he could prove he was the killer, the inquiry seemed to turn a new page. O'Brien had taken them all to a residence in Detroit where Sheeran shot Hoffa and blood evidence might still be found. The blood recovered in the residence, however, was not Hoffa's, and the police were back to square one. Mr. O'Brien, of course, denied any involvement in Jimmy Hoffa's death and disappearance, even claiming that he was never in the automobile where the hair was discovered. Although he was a buddy of Jimmy Hoffa, it has been speculated that he was paid as a professional hitman to assassinate him. In 2009, a hitman named Richard Kuklinski published a book called The Iceman: Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer, which could have provided another break in the case. He stated in that book that he assassinated Jimmy Hoffa with a knife, burned his body, and buried him in a 55-gallon drum in a junkyard. Eventually, the 55-gallon drum was allegedly compacted in a car that was sold to a Japanese company as scrap metal and shipped to that country. There were also other individuals who claimed to have known what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. In one case, a gangster known as Tony Zarelli stated that the body of Jimmy Hoffa was in a shallow grave near the restaurant where he was last seen. The FBI scoured the area thoroughly for 3 days before calling it a day when no human remains were discovered. Additional reports have appeared, some of which may or may not lead to the discovery of Jimmy Hoffa's body, but none have yielded any results. There are rumors that Hoffa's body was buried in the Giant Stadium, but with the use of a ground-penetrating radar by a Discovery show called the Mythbusters, no trace of human remains were found. When the Giant Stadium was demolished in 2010, no human remains were found. According to the FBI, the most likely explanation is that the new Teamster leadership ordered a hit on Hoffa to prevent him from regaining control of the union. It's quite improbable that his body will ever be discovered at this point. Unless somebody comes forward with additional information or with some shred of evidence that would point to where the body is located, it may remain a mystery that is never solved.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to say that I am incredibly grateful that you took time out of your schedule to listen to my narration. This is Nikki of Twysted Mind, wishing you a great rest of your day. Salamat.